Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Hello again, I'm your host, Paul Barter. This episode of Reinventing Parking is about how to worry less about abolishing parking minimums, or how to help others worry less if you're not worried yourself. As you probably know, in the conventional approach to parking supply since the 1950s, local governments almost everywhere force every real estate development to have more than enough on-site parking to meet all of its own parking demand at all times. There are many strong reasons to oppose this approach. I won't go into those now, and many of you are listening to this podcast because you already care about this issue. But if you want to know more about that, a search on the Reinventing Parking website would be a start. There's some good news on this topic, fortunately. Momentum is gathering against this conventional approach, and the minimums are increasingly being abolished or lowered in many cities around the world. Unfortunately, progress is slow. Keeping parking minimums as they are seems the easy option, and change seems risky. People who are sceptical about abolishing parking minimums raise various objections. And today my focus is to offer some answers to some of those objections. In fact, I'm going to have a particularly narrow focus on answering people who worry that abolishing minimum parking requirements will cause shortages of on-site parking, and that those shortages will cause wider problems. So let's get started with some answers. One simple answer is to point to the growing list of places around the world that already are abandoning the conventional approach and abolishing their minimum parking requirements. Examples include London, Berlin, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Buffalo, and a fair few others. There's also a much longer list of cities where at least some or most of the parking minimums have been abolished. Many cities have abolished them completely for the city centre area, for example. And quite a few have abolished all parking requirements for areas zoned for commercial uses. Some of these places have been doing without parking minimums for a long time now. And as far as I know, most places that abolished parking minimums seem satisfied with their decision. Chaos and mayhem did not result. For example, if you listened to the Reinventing Parking episode on Berlin, you would have heard that parking minimums were completely abolished in the late 1990s. London has had no parking minimums for about 15 years. Neither Berlin nor London are perfect on parking or free of parking problems, but generally the problems feared before parking minimums were ended have not come true. And neither city has any concerted campaign to reinstate parking minimums that I'm aware of. Another reassuring point to make to parking minimum abolition skeptics is that change happens slowly. Most change to the supply of parking results from the workings of the urban real estate industry, such as changes in the uses of buildings, redevelopments, and new developments. Some existing parking can also be changed to other uses. But these things tend to happen incrementally, in fits and starts. The supply of parking does not suddenly plummet when parking minimums are abolished. In fact, abolishing parking minimums, which sounds radical and a recipe for drastic change, is actually a surprisingly moderate and gradualist step to take. So that's another answer. Abolishing minimum parking requirements is a moderate reform. The more drastic step is to impose parking maximums, which limit how much parking can be provided with each real estate development. In fact, even imposing maximums is a mild reform if the new maximums are not much lower than the old minimums that they replaced. So on its own, just abolishing the minimums does not cause rapid change in the parking scene. It turns out that the people who redevelop or build buildings or change their uses usually keep providing parking, even after the end of parking minimums. For example, in Berlin, which I mentioned just now, sustainable transport advocates have actually been disappointed about how much parking still gets built with new buildings, more than 20 years after parking minimums were completely abolished. Many cities that have abolished parking minimums in their central areas have seen lots of repurposing and sometimes redevelopment of old buildings on small plots of land. This is what we want to see. This kind of change was being prevented by the parking minimums very often. But such development is hardly radical. The sites involved often had little or no parking even before the change. So in cities with no parking minimums, some buildings do go up with little or no parking. This typically happens in locations that are very easily accessible by other modes besides private vehicle. And the reason for the low parking provision is often that the developer judges that parking demand associated with the building will actually be very low. Now, there are some other reasons why developers might put little parking, and we'll talk about them later. Here's another answer on why we need not worry so much. Developers and building managers can take steps to actively reduce demand. They don't just have to match parking supply to the expected unmanaged parking demand. So we can stay calm even if we expect some real estate developments to provide less parking than the current demand would seem to require. In the Reinventing Parking episode last year with Todd Littman, he was persuasive that there are tried and tested things parking managers can do to encourage alternative mobility options and therefore reduce parking demand and need less parking. There's a range of site-based travel demand management strategies they can deploy. A certain amount of demand management can be the plan from the start, and such efforts often have some flexibility to be ramped up even more if necessary. Of course, even if you explain all of that to people, many of them will still worry. They may still worry, for example, that developers won't try hard enough to make parking supply match with demand. So buildings will go up with less parking than the parking demand associated with that building. So, for example, the skeptics about abolishing parking minimums fear mistakes. Maybe developers intend to build enough parking to serve their building's own parking demand, but they might underestimate. The idea is that such mistakes will be much more likely after we abolish those parking minimums that are typically now set high enough to be really safe to avoid this problem. Or the developers and the building managers may have planned to take strong steps to reduce parking demand, but those steps don't work as well as they were hoped to. Abolition skeptics also seem to fear foul play by those nasty developers. Some of them worry that developers might deliberately underprovide parking out of greed, knowing full well that the parking demand at their buildings will be higher than they cater for. The claim here is that they are deliberately shifting the problem onto neighbours and onto whatever authorities have to deal with the resulting problems. So the classic Shoupista answer, the answer based on the parking policy work of Professor Donald Shoup, is that cities can deter such mistakes or such foul play. If cities manage the on-street parking well enough, they will ensure that developers have a strong incentive not to make mistakes and not to pull a fast one about the amount of parking they provide. The idea is that well-managed city-owned parking, actually both off-street and on-street, will mean that there can be no free riding by motorists whose parking is associated with visiting new buildings or working in new buildings or living in new buildings. So if you buy or lease or rent space in a building, you will know in advance that any on-street parking nearby for you or your customers or your employees is subject to management, including fees. In that case, you'll pay close attention to the parking and to the mobility situation before signing. And knowing that their customers are paying attention to this, developers should have a strong incentive to make a wise decision before they build about the amount of parking to build. So well-managed parking gives developers enough incentive to look into parking and get their provision about right. They may not be perfect, but it should be much closer to optimal parking supply than we would get with parking minimums. Parking minimums, after all, are almost guaranteed to result in a wasteful oversupply, a glut of parking. We know that this approach works broadly speaking. So, for example, huge numbers of downtowns in many different countries have been managing without any parking minimums, in some cases for decades. Of course, The real problem here, perhaps, is that usually there's some opposition to the kind of parking management effort that we know can solve these problems. But that's a whole different story, and that's a whole different argument. That's not really a worry about the effects of abolishing parking minimums, it's opposition to parking management. Failing to abolish parking minimums is no guarantee that you can avoid having better parking management. The chaos in the streets, as we've heard in many different episodes of Reinventing Parking, often happens even with parking minimums. But let's get back to that Schupista answer, that we can send the right incentives to developers to build the right amount of parking. Many skeptics about the abolition of parking minimums don't buy it. They still worry that such deterrence will not be enough, and their worst fears will be realised. There will be parking spillover. The new buildings will be free riding on the new parking. Fortunately, there is an answer even if that worst case scenario happens. In many contexts, it doesn't matter if parking demand associated with a building spills over beyond the site. Many areas can cope with that. How? Well, many areas, especially dense and mixed-use areas, have at least some parking that is open to the public. Many neighbourhoods are park once and walk areas, at least to some extent. The normal thing is for motorists to park somewhere, not necessarily in the building or on the site that they're going to, and walk. In such areas, off-site public parking, whether it's on-street or off-street, can handle some spillover. In such areas, this public parking tends to be a large proportion of the parking, and it tends to be priced and reasonably well managed. So if you're driving to visit a building in an area like that and its parking is full, or maybe it has no parking, it's not a problem. You park nearby in public priced parking, which might be on-site with some other building, it might be a standalone garage or a parking lot, or it might be on-street parking. In any case, it generally speaking is not a problem. Depending on where you are and the kind of places you are familiar with, this point might seem odd, or it might seem blindingly obvious. Actually, this is an argument that even dedicated Schupistas, even dedicated parking reformers often forget. It's not an explicit part of the usual set of arguments from Donald Shoup and the followers of Donald Shoup. So, in my experience, it really does need to be spelled out. Most of the places around the world where parking minimums have already been abolished to some extent tend to be the places that are older mixed-use areas, many downtowns, as I said before. The lack of problems with abolishing the parking requirements in this kind of area was not mainly because real estate development in these areas tried especially hard to get their parking supply just right. No, the lack of problems in these areas is primarily because whenever a building site change adds to parking demand around that site, the area can cope. In park once and walk areas, if we abolish parking minimums, it's not a problem, even if we end up with lots of spillover. Such areas are designed for spillover. And we should make more areas work like that. Many parts of our metropolitan areas are only partially park once and walk areas. If we try to prevent spillover with parking minimums, we'll only make those places ever more car dependent. It would be much better to foster walkable parking, park once and walk planning in these areas. The more we do that, the less they need to worry about parking spillover. So, in a park once and walk area, in a place with walkable parking, how would developers of building sites decide how much parking to provide on site with a new building, especially if there's no parking minimums? Well, they would do much more than just assess how much parking demand their own site would generate. They would also be looking at the whole area. They'll be thinking about whether or not they might be able to lease some dedicated parking, perhaps for some of their tenants, or make deals with nearby sites for shared parking. They'd consider if some of the parking by their tenants, visitors, customers, residents, whatever, might simply be handled by the local public parking. They'll likely assume that their own on-site parking, or at least some of it, will be open to the public, and they'll investigate the local parking prices and the local situation with demand and supply. They'll look at nearby public parking and ask how much is there, what do they charge, is it well occupied, and when. They'll think about whether maybe their new building might influence the prices in the area. A large building might cause a rise in prices if they don't build much parking. So some developers may try to have enough on-site parking, but enough would be much more of a holistic concept than the old mindset with parking minimums would ever consider. And if some developers get it slightly wrong, that's usually okay as well. Most park once and walk areas have enough flexibility to handle modest mistakes when it comes to parking demand. Having some buildings with insufficient parking for their own demand is just not a serious problem for districts that have thoroughly walkable parking, with well-managed public parking, well-managed on-street parking, and management practices including prices that can respond or adapt to changing conditions. So this is crucial. A park once and walk area tends to be responsive, adaptable. Changes like a new building with maybe not enough parking are not such a crisis in such an area. So remember, in such areas, spillover parking is entirely normal. It's usually not a problem at all. It's just parking. Regular listeners, of course, or readers of Reinventing Parking will recognize a lot of this. It's the idea of walkable parking and park once and walk parking planning that I've been talking about quite a lot over the last 2 years or so. Now, spillover parking can be a problem in some contexts. The main place I can think of where spillover parking would be a problem is in the most extremely automobile-dependent areas. By and large, these are areas that have little or no parking that's open to the general public. Most parking is signposted as customers only or residents only or employees only or something similar. There's very little on-street parking. So maybe areas like that need parking minimums to prevent on-site parking shortages? Actually, I doubt it, even for those areas. I doubt that even areas like that need parking minimums. If you're going to build a building in an area like that, you will know that this is an automobile-dependent area without public parking. You will know that you need to provide enough parking on-site. It will be part of your business strategy in all likelihood. If the occasional developer decides they could perhaps get away with a little less than usual, perhaps with some sharing arrangement with a neighbouring site, well, why stop that? I can't think of any realistic scenarios where failing to have parking minimums would cause a problem. What are we trying to prevent? Even in these areas where spillover would be a problem, I think it's incredibly unlikely to ever be a problem. So I think we really should all be much more worried about parking oversupply than about any of the parking shortage scenarios that people who oppose abolishing parking minimums worry about. After all, an undersupply, some kind of shortage, can be coped with in various ways. There's management, there's demand management, there's responsive parking prices, there's sharing arrangements, and you can even build a bit of new supply strategically if necessary. But a chronic oversupply causes a huge range of problems and tends to get locked in. It's very hard to even notice it. People just assume free parking is normal. It's hard to overcome a chronic glut of parking. We heard in the Reinventing Parking episode about Mexico City, where there was a successful campaign against parking minimums, and that it ended up flipping the narrative. The parking supply regulations in Mexico City no longer see parking spillover beyond each site as an impact to worry about and that needs to be tackled with parking minimums. Instead, the new regulations see excessive parking as causing excessive traffic and excessive costs of many kinds, and that this impact needs to be contained with parking maximums and a fee imposed on off-street parking spaces to give an incentive for developers to provide less rather than more. That is quite a change in mindset, and I think that's the change in mindset that many cities need. So let me wrap up with a summary. This episode has been about easing people's worries about what might happen if we let real estate sites have less parking than we thought they needed according to the old parking requirements. Many real cities actually are abolishing minimum parking requirements. They are seeing mostly benefits with very few problems. Abandoning parking minimums is much more gradual and moderate than many people think, anyway. Most developments still get on-site parking. Abolishing parking minimums does not mean abolishing parking. If on-street parking management is good enough, most developers will see an incentive to provide about the right amount of parking. And if on-site parking does get tight, there are many tools to moderate the demand. And in any case, even if the worst case happens and there is parking spillover, in most neighbourhoods, most areas, that is usually not a problem if they are even halfway towards being good park once and walk areas. And we should improve the extent to which they embrace walkable parking and park once walk areas. That would be a better solution if any such areas do have problems with spillover. We can stop worrying whether every site has enough parking. We can stop thinking of parking as being for any particular plot of land. We can stop worrying about spillover at all if we think of parking spaces as something for their whole vicinity. So walkable parking and effective park once and walk areas can cope. They have parking management and a responsive parking ecosystem that can generally keep parking demand and parking supply roughly in balance for the whole neighbourhood, or close enough. In such areas, spillover is not a problem. It's just parking. We don't need parking minimums at all. I hope this has given you a little bit of ammunition, a few arguments you can use if you're confronted with people who are worried about shortages of on-site parking when we abolish parking minimums. Good luck. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.